Hi, humans. Happy post-holiday day. For those of you who celebrate, I hope you had a great Christmas. For those of you who don't, I hope you had a wonderful day. Sorry, we've got some tippy tappies from my little dog. I worked a little bit today, and then we were able to go for a walk and get lunch, and it was really nice. But I had a podcast topic, which was, inspired by another podcast. I did post it to my stories. It's the Diary of the CEO. He was speaking to an attorney a trial attorney who goes to court, and was talking about communication. And I thought it was interesting. He had a lot of really good and valid points. I guess the one thing that kind of stuck out to me is co-regulation, and especially emotional co-regulation. And I use this idea often when we are in conflict with another person, and especially if that other person has tendencies to react in a big way. And the reason I said react in a big way rather than overreact is because sometimes those reactions are very valid and important. However, it is not really helpful to connection and communication. And when we think about reactions in a big way, I like to think about children because they do not have the skills or ability to be able to regulate their own emotional reactions to most things. And they have, what looks like unhinged reactions to very minor things, or things that for the adult in the situation is unwarranted, right? However, we as adults deal with other adults who can react in a big way. And when we think about the idea of co-regulation, it's really being able to put ourselves in a situation to understand the emotional reaction. And specific to children, it's to be able to get them to co-regulate down to a more maybe calm or less reactive place. But co-regulation can happen in the opposite direction, right? And so when someone is, specifically an adult, is reacting in a big way, having a lot of big emotions that are generally not helpful, and they're saying unhelpful things, the ability to communicate and create understanding and curiosity and compassion and all of those things goes right out the window. And oftentimes what will happen is that whoever they're in a conversation or conflict with will co-regulate to that higher level. And then we're just screaming and yelling and shouting unhelpful things at each other, which, as evidenced by the word unhelpful, is not going to get us to that place where we can have healthy conflict. But I was thinking about this. And so the guy was talking about narcissists and, people, using gaslighting language. And so for those of you who don't know, gaslighting is kind of shifting a reality from our shared reality to one person's perspective, where you feel like you're crazy, or you are reacting to something and then they go, "Why are you being all crazy?" A lot of times it's a manipulation technique. It's very intentional. And it's interesting, right? When you think about co-regulation, is someone is reacting out of, in pure chaos, and then they get someone else to chaos, and then they're like, "Why are you being all crazy? Why are you all mad about it?" And it's interesting to think about. So when he talked about gaslighting, he talks about really bringing someone into the reality of the gaslighter. And he did talk about co-regulation in a way that I had some feelings about. The information was good, but he talked about how a lot of times women are the ones that are reactive. I think that both genders can be reactive, both sexes can be reactive, both men and women can be reactive, and the people who choose anything in between. However, it's interesting in my practice when I am working specifically with a client who has a partner who can be gaslighty, right? Who can gaslight my client, or is often the one with the bigger feelings. A lot of times my clients, specifically female, but not all, will say like, I don't want to have a hard conversation with them because they're going to have a big reaction. They're going to get mad, or it doesn't feel safe for me to share my feelings, whatever they are, because they're going to react in a way that's unhelpful. And I found it interesting, right? Because again, this is a very smart man who has experience dealing with humans who communicate, and specifically in conflict. And that it's true, right? I've definitely had people in my life who are gaslighty and will definitely want me to join their reality in chaos and anger. And I speak to my clients often when they have a reactive person in their life. One of the first tools is to pause, right? Before reacting to whatever it is they're reacting to, right? If they're having, a big feeling about, let's say, putting gas in the car, whatever. And their partner is going off and, you never do this and you're always leaving me in this situation and whatever the situation is. Rather than getting into it with them at that same level, we want to bring it down a notch. And part of how we do that is to pause, right? Just to not get into the melee with them, not get into the chaos. The next piece is to kind of recognize, oh, they're unhinged for whatever reason. I like the word unhinged because it means that they're not opening and closing it the right way. But really thinking about like, what is it that they're going through? And we don't have that moment often to kind of have an understanding of where this reaction is coming from. And it's one of the communication tools that I teach clients, especially when they have a partner, or whomever they're speaking with is having a big reaction, is to, paraphrase or to use active listening and say, this is what I heard you say. Was that your intention? But oftentimes when someone is coming at you, full throttle up at a 10, it's really hard not to like come at a 3 and go, this is what I heard you say. But if we pause and go, okay, what is happening, right? Oftentimes, most of us are triggered back to a situation where we didn't feel safe, or we don't feel like we can engage with them. And so when we don't feel safe, oftentimes we're going to react in a defensive way. And so we're going to meet that level of frustration or anger, and we'll be like, what do you mean I never, blah, blah, blah. I put gas in the car all the time and whatever it is. So we tend to co-regulate to that higher level rather than, in a pause, check with like, you're right, I didn't fill up the car, right? And not get into the chaos with them. And so really thinking about this idea of co-regulation or co-regulating is not just to get down to their, to whatever level that we want them to get at, is to not get into that higher level of anger and frustration where people are like calling out your name and acting all, big emotions, unrealistically big emotions, right? It's interesting because when we can think about a small person having big feelings, they don't have the emotional awareness of how to regulate those big feelings. And so it's our responsibility not to get in that same level of having a fit with them, but to maybe meet them where they're at and, kind of give some space to their big feelings. And also that's where we want to co-regulate them down to where we are. But a lot of times parents are frustrated and overwhelmed and tired and, insert negative feeling here. And so it's really challenging for us to react to someone kicking the back of our seat, asking us to change the music in a way that is helpful and being like, I see that you have big feelings, Timmy. What we need to do is maybe stop kicking the seat and figuring out what we're going to listen to together. That is the most beautiful, way to be able to manage our littles. Unrealistic most of the time, especially when that's like the 8th meltdown Timmy has had, and kicking the seat is very frustrating, if not dangerous. But when we think about the idea of co-regulation, right? Do we want to get in the chaos, or do we want to bring them or invite them into our peace, into our curiosity, into our space of communication, rather than meeting someone where they are at this like really high level, and they're not saying helpful things. I was thinking about one set of clients in particular. The teenager was coming to see me, and she had spoken about how often, one of her parents will have a big reaction to something, and depending on, where they are emotionally, or what kind of day they've had, or, whatever the situation, oftentimes, she would shut down and just not engage. And it had two effects. One was, if she didn't engage, sometimes the high level of frustration would get higher, or they would, not be able to, they would get more frustrated oftentimes. And as a parent who has an I don't know kid, why did you do the thing? I don't know. That's not the most helpful answer. But it can get you really more riled up and frustrated. But one time I was like, it often feels like when you guys have these conversations that they are looking for a right answer, a correct answer. And sometimes it's helpful, and even just from not a place of emotional reaction or activity, to be like, what is the right answer, right? Because you're not listening to me when I give you the answer that I've got. And so what is the right answer, right? Just giving enough curiosity. Now, I will tell you that from a teenager's perspective, that can feel really dangerous, to be like, because it feels like you're being a smartass. But it is helpful as a question to be like, I'm not sure what answer you're looking for, right? Oftentimes, parents will have it in their mind what it is that they are expecting in terms of the conversation. And I can admit that I've been that parent at times. But what I was looking for is the truth often, or just an understanding. But I wasn't asking with understanding. I was coming out with accusation, right? And so it's helpful often. I remember at one point asking as a parent, having known the answer, because we rarely ask a question we don't already know the answer to, that I was like, okay, did you do this thing? And before you answer, know that I know the truth, right? Just understand that I know what the truth is. I'm giving you an opportunity. And so then, my child would answer and whatever the situation was. And I'd be like, okay, try again, right? At that point, I was not as frustrated because I knew the dance and game of what we were going to do when I asked a question that I knew the answer to. But if I genuinely was curious and understanding, like, what in the world made you do that thing? After a certain point, I was able to ask from a calmer place rather than taking whatever her behavior was personally. And so when we think about a little, oftentimes we are going to take their behavior personally. And as I've spoken to with many parents, we are trying to apply adult logic to a child's, perspective or behavior, which is unhelpful to us and the child. Really recognizing that they're not thinking about their future self, being a terrible human being who lies and, whatever it is, dysregulates themselves. We're thinking about every version of our kid. And oftentimes when we are parenting, especially with littles, we want them to learn things in a way that makes them, productive members of society, or at least contributes to their making the right choice. Unfortunately, we have to parent at an age appropriate level. And fortunately or unfortunately, really recognizing that if we are applying adult logic to a child situation, rarely are we going to, hit the mark. Often we're going to have to get down to their level of understanding and try to figure out why you're hitting your brother, right? It's curious to me often because we parent from our regular experience of life, having had years and years of, life teach us lessons, whereas they're just learning, they're just figuring it out. And sometimes it's funny, right? And sometimes they're like, wow, that was not the thing I expected you to do, right? But specifically when they're having a hard time and they are having big emotions, we want to be able to meet those emotions with compassion and understanding, if not curiosity, rather than taking it personally and, assuming that they are intentionally trying to mess with our day. I'm getting ready to get on a plane next week, and I have had a few different flights where there is a child behind me kicking or moving the table or doing whatever. It's taken every ounce of my patience and compassion to understand that this kid did not get on a plane specifically to mess with my day. But I have more understanding today than I did at those times. And so it is an opportunity for us when we think about co-regulation, rather than getting into the chaos with our child, to bring a level of calm and peace and understanding. And if you do not have the capacity to do that in the moment, it's okay to take a step back. And back to this example of the kid kicking the back of the seat, pull over, right? Find a parking lot. Nothing is that dire or important that you need to fight with a kid while you're driving. It is not safe for you. It is not safe for them. And it is not the learning opportunity that you want it to be if you're just yelling back and getting into it with them, right? So specific to children, nothing is more important than being able to be safe and also understand where your kid is coming from. And that does not mean from a codependent way of acquiescing or giving into or enabling that kind of behavior, because what we also know to be true is that kids will learn how to find your vulnerability. And so if they know that, and I don't think it's like, again, a conscious choice for them to be able to, like, at 6:00 when you pick me up from soccer practice, when you and I are both hungry and tired, that's when I'm going to go for it, right? That's when I'm going to mess up your day. But it is an opportunity to recognize that, like, they're also tired. All of those big feelings that you're feeling are things that they're feeling. And so if at 6:00 you tend to have meltdowns, then that's an opportunity to take it a little bit more slowly, have a little bit more compassion, and maybe offer a snack. Just saying. But it is also important for us to create some repair if we have lost our shit more than once. Understanding that, like, kids are so over, like, scheduled and they have so many things. And part of that is because we struggle to find ways for kids to be creative and bored. If they're bored, they're going to frustrate us and they need to have all of these extra things. And we'll talk about that on another podcast. But sometimes it's important just to sit still for a little bit and to let ourselves calm down before we get back on the road. And, all of us end up having a rough time. So co-regulating is really trying to understand with compassion what the other person could be going through without meeting them in that same level of chaos. Now, as I've talked about children, I think it's important to also recognize how to co-regulate in a healthy way with a partner who tends to have big reactions or big feelings. Sometimes that's situational, but sometimes that might be a pattern of behavior. And it's important to recognize that, like, if your partner is often getting dysregulated around certain topics or around certain things, and they tend to have big reactions to you sharing your emotions or sharing your perspective, that's a pattern to pay attention to. It's also a pattern to recognize that, like, if you often feel like you're walking on eggshells because of the fear that they are going to become unhinged when you have an expression of feeling or just, trying to communicate with them, also something to pay attention to. My point is, don't get in the melee with them. Don't get into that dysregulated reaction place, because you're not going to come to understanding. You're not going to be able to have healthy conflict, and you're definitely not going to have healthy resolution. A lot of times people, when I teach the communication section of couples therapy or relationship counseling, oftentimes there will be a high context communicator, someone who says the same thing over and over and over again. And a low context communicator is someone who does not reciprocate with as many words. And it's actually not gendered. Like, it really just depends on the couple and the situation. One of the reasons people tend to be higher in context, where they have to say the same thing over and over and over, is likely because they did not feel heard as a child or somewhere before now, either in a previous relationship or in the house that they grew up in. A lot of times people who are low context communicators have given up because they were not heard, and so there was no point in saying things. And when I'm teaching that skill of sometimes you're going to have to say more words than you're used to, and to the high context communicator, I will say, okay, sometimes you're just going to have to listen and not say as many words. You do not have to fill up the silence with trying to explain, justify, or validate your point, right? And specific to high reactivity and people who tend to get really emotional in conflict, something to pay attention to, really recognizing, like, there could be a lot of reasons. There could be so many, like I said, it could be situational. It could be I've had a really rough day and this was my last straw. It could be I have, been trying to get you to do the thing that I need you to do, and I've asked you 87 different ways, 87 different times, and you're not doing it, right? There could be a history of, I have sat with my feelings for a long time, and now I'm having the opportunity to say it because we've popped off about one thing or another, and now I'm going to say all the words. It's something to pay attention to, really recognizing, and I say this to clients often, especially in relationship counseling, is it's your responsibility to share with your partner how you are feeling. They are not going to know that. They cannot assume that. They can usually find some tells as to what kind of day you've had, but if you don't say words, that's your responsibility, right? If you don't say to your partner, hey, I have had a shit day, and usually I will encourage them to text ahead of time before they get home, to just let their partner know this is what you're walking into as we come together at the end of the day, either to prepare food for our children or to interact with one another. And so if you don't communicate how you're feeling and then you get home to chaos, then you're going to jump right into at the highest level of reactivity, right? Now, if it comes to hard conversations, also situational, but really recognizing how much you've held on to that you are now taking the opportunity to then throw at your partner. Unhelpful, but it happens, right? And so it's important to, one, vent and let off steam and say how you're feeling in small increments when it is happening, rather than to wait until we're both in a fight situation or in conflict. And now I'm going to say all of the terrible things I've been holding on to for weeks, right? All of us have had that experience where we have a partner who is always talking about, or often, not always, often talking about things that have happened before now because they haven't come to resolution about it. And so every time there's conflict, we're going to throw those things at each other. And that's a really great way to co-regulate at that higher level where we're not communicating and we're not creating understanding and we're not creating some helpful communication. We're definitely not creating resolution. And so these are small tools and skills, but to recognize that co-regulation happens in both directions. And if we are wanting to have more and healthier communication with our partner, it would be helpful to have these small conversations when things are bothering us when we are calm, rather than waiting until we're frustrated and overwhelmed and then starting a fight because I have taken it and taken it and taken it, and now I just can't take it anymore. Unhelpful. Like I said, something to pay attention to is to recognize if you are expressing a feeling or frustration and then your partner reacts in a big way, something to pay attention to. Recognize that you cannot be understood if you are then at that same high level of emotional reactivity. They're not going to hear you and you're not going to find any understanding at that place. Also to recognize that if you are often shut down from sharing your emotions or feelings or even perspective with your partner, that's a bigger issue. And it's going to be difficult to have healthy communication in that dynamic. So anyway, that's where my brain was. I was thinking about, the podcast I wanted to share with you guys. At the end of the year, it is December 26th of 2025, and we have had an amazing year of, great content and lots of experiences. I do like to reflect on the end of the year and think about the goals that I met, and some of the things that I would like, for 2026. And I'm always grateful when I can look back on the year and recognize that the things that I had set out to do, I was able to do and do it successfully. Obviously, building back my business was a task, and we had a couple, challenges in terms of having to move office, and just kind of figuring out what it is like for me to do all of the things that I do pretty consistently. I'm often told that like it's pretty awesome, the things that I do in terms of, have a podcast that is successful, do my job on a regular basis, be an author of a book that is doing relatively well. I'm actually quite impressed, with like very little promotional budget and all the things. Like self-publishing is not for the faint of heart, and it's definitely not going to make you $1 million. However, I am grateful often because I recognize that the things that I do, I get to do by myself, and I get to do them on my own. And so the buck stops here, yes, but I'm also really kind of impressed with myself that I am able to do the things that I do regularly. And I do think it's important to toot your own horn and to acknowledge the things that you've done well. There have been struggles this year for sure, and my therapist knows about those. But I have been able to work through them, and I, even with, my seasonal depression and all the things, like I'm ending the year on a high note, and I'm very grateful that I am able to, have the business and practice that I want to have, and treat the people that I want to treat, and continue to create a positive reputation in that space where, I have clients that will tell other people, hey, this therapist is really good. And that is how I've grown a whole business. So thank you. They also share the podcast or, share the book or do whatever. Like that feels really satisfying to know that like I continue to do that for as long as I will be able to continue to do that. I've had some other really incredible personal wins this year, and I'm super grateful for the people that share that with me. In terms of goals for the next year, I do need to finish the second book, The Year of Detachment. I have had some really great people tell me how to maybe work writing into my practice, which they were right. I'm looking forward to continuing. I'm starting a presentation on the 12th with New Mexico Counseling Association. If you are a therapist and you want to hear my Codependency for Pros, that's going to be on the 12th. I think it's from 9 to 11 online. You can check in the New Mexico Counseling Association website, and you'll see that there. I do plan on giving more codependency skills workshops. That's going to be a goal. So yeah, I'm looking forward to what 2026 has to bring. This year was crazy and wild and awesome and very textured with all of the things. Thank you to everyone who's listening all over the world. I am humbled often when I look at my statistics to know that this little podcast continues to grow and to reach lots of different places. Again, if you want to get a hold of me, if you have something you want me to talk about for 30 minutes, I will do that. You can reach me at lx2.cod.coach@gmail.com. You can follow me on all of my platforms, on Instagram, on TikTok, on Facebook, some version of Luna X2 LLC or LX2 COD coaching. So there is your nugget. I hope you have a wonderful and safe New Year's Eve. I will be in California. So you will not have a podcast next week, but I will get into the new year, and we will have another one the following week. So I'll talk to you soon. Take care.